When the ego always has to win and we all end up losing, but instead where the community wins?
Whenever you offer some criticism, there are immediately tears, even though it wasn't meant personally at all.
For example, how can we in the business world actually develop people into responsible and truly effective leaders?
When the ego is in charge, everyone loses.
Those who don't fit this simplistic idea that you need to have narcissistic traits to be a leader.
Dear community, dear listeners, dear viewers, we're delighted to welcome you to a new episode of the Digital.Decoded podcast today. Today, the topic is when the ego leads, everyone loses. An exciting topic all about leadership. And of course, I'd like to once again welcome my dear colleague, André Kiehne. And we're looking forward to discussing this topic with you today. Just a quick reminder to everyone. Please feel free to share your input, send us your topics, and join the discussion. Yes, Andre, this is certainly a provocative topic. When the ego leads, everyone loses. So are you an egoist?
You know, Mario, I think we're all a bit of an egoist to some extent. And I actually wrote a LinkedIn article about this. It revolves around narcissists, which is, of course, a provocative term to begin with. And this article is about how, especially in leadership positions and in politics, we often encounter people with narcissistic traits. So first of all, Mario, what exactly is a narcissist? A narcissist is someone who puts their ego above everyone else, needs constant attention, always has to be praised, and doesn't care at all about other people's feelings. So that's basically what a narcissist is. Now, you could easily confuse that with self-confidence. Yes, and I think not just in leadership, but in all areas of life, we naturally need a certain amount of self-confidence. But now I'm coming back exactly to your question. If you can't regulate that, if you feel insecure and because of that insecurity depend on external validation, then you have narcissistic tendencies. But if you are quite aware of both your strengths and your weaknesses, and you're not afraid to bring them in or to compensate for them through a team around you, then we're talking about self-confidence. So, and I wrote in the article, Mario, that of course, and I mean, Mario, we've already been through many crises in various companies, in many situations. We've experienced different economic crises, gone through restructurings, transformations, and so on. And it's precisely in these crisis situations, and there are interesting studies about this, that people with narcissistic traits are actually more successful because they push ahead without regard for losses, without considering the feelings of others in any way. And that's why I would say, yes, we are all egoists to some extent, but in my view, it only becomes harmful when we can't regulate it, when we are always egoists.
Well, the best example of a narcissistic and egotistical leader can currently be seen in America or also in Russia. Yes, that's becoming more and more widespread. Of course, you might be able to learn something from that in business or maybe not, right? Trump is always referred to as a deal maker. I think in some ways he is, but the question is always, deals at any price, right? And when I look at it from a business perspective, we recently discussed the topic of bringing more humanity into business. And you can also see that narcissism and egoism are becoming much more prevalent. And on the other hand, people are increasingly wishing for more collegiality. And as a result, I would say more leadership, coaching, and guidance. That's obviously a huge area of tension. And of course, it also creates significant challenges.
Yes, Mario, absolutely. And, the interesting thing is, and you just mentioned Trump and Putin, I think we can go further back in history, or we can look at the business world or other countries. The question is always, why are these people in power in society, in politics, or in companies? And I would say the simple answer, put a bit provocatively, is because we allow it. So we as people, as the population, as employees, we allow it. We have supervisory boards and so on. That means narcissistic traits, especially in leadership, are still somewhat rewarded these days. So the question I ask myself is, how can we manage to build a leadership culture that is not shaped by narcissistic traits? Yes, so to come back to the title, not where the ego always has to win and we all end up losing, but where the community wins. And I think that's a really exciting question, how, for example, in the business world, we can get to a point where we actually develop people for responsible and leadership positions who don't fit into this simple mold that you have to have narcissistic traits to be a leader.
Yes, I agree with you. On the other hand, of course, it's also the case, and we're noticing this more and more, that there really aren't that many people anymore, especially among the younger generation, who even want this kind of responsibility. They say, oh, that's all way too much for me, and then I have to make so many decisions and so on and so forth. And I think that's exactly the tension we're living in nowadays. Because in reality, you also have to be a bit selfish, egocentric, and even narcissistic to some extent in order to move things forward, right? I mean, everyone likes these doers, these entrepreneurs. And on the other hand, we've now developed this kind of cuddly mentality within individual companies. If you ever offer some criticism, there are immediately tears, even though it wasn't meant personally at all. And people, I mean, everything is supposed to run collegially. Everyone should somehow be able to contribute as well. And yeah, let's be honest, at the end of the day, it doesn't really work because someone has to make a decision. And we see that now in politics too, because those who are relatively strong and give people direction, those are the ones people follow.
That's how it is. But that's kind of paradoxical, Mario. Yeah, totally. Absolutely spot on. Actually, we all kind of want this cuddly culture which has crept into many companies. I find the discussion about performance really, really interesting, which we can currently follow in the media. But on the other hand, yeah, we elect people or have leaders in companies who actually embody the exact opposite.
Yeah, exactly. And totally paradoxical.
Do you have an explanation? Well, I find it difficult.
Oh, I think, well, I wouldn't really call it an explanation. Unfortunately, I'm not a psychologist. I always admire it when someone can do that and can deduce everything. That's not me. I'm really a classic salesperson, but I think it's partly just general uncertainty. Everything is uncertain these days. Yeah, even because of Corona or after Corona, it was like that. Absolute values that always applied, that were always valid, are now being questioned. And I think that because of this uncertainty, people develop a need for strength, right? And of course, people also want someone who says, look, that's the way to go. And then they also want someone who does exactly that, but is actually also really nice somehow, right? That's kind of paradoxical too.
Exactly. And you can have both, but especially we just tried at the beginning to sort it out a bit. People with narcissistic traits simply don't have this ability to regulate themselves. They are always speaking in polarizing terms, always egotistical, and can't be empathetic on the other side. So as I said, don't confuse this with self-confidence, where you do have a certain ability to regulate yourself. And I also find it interesting that we humans, especially in the times we're living in now, with many crises, a lot of uncertainty, and also a lot of uncertainty within companies, that we're actually looking for orientation. Although I would say seeking orientation or having orientation is a completely natural human need. We all have that. We all want to have orientation. That's totally logical. And my thesis, Mario, is that you can be very successful in the short term thanks to such people. Again, I really don't want to talk it down at all. There are certainly times and situations where it can be quite helpful to have people with a big ego. It can definitely be helpful, right? I just mentioned crises, major transformations, restructurings, and so on and so forth. So in the short term, I believe that can be very successful. But what we also see in companies, and I'd be interested to hear your opinion on this, is that whenever you do this over a certain period of time, the company's performance tends to go down again because dissatisfaction increases, right? Actually, everything is running smoothly now, or at least heading in the right direction. We see light at the end of the tunnel, but the satisfaction and also the willingness to perform in companies decreases because this, let me put it simply, this empathy component is missing in leadership, in values, in the culture, and that's where performance in companies drops.
Yes, I would say that's definitely true, but I'd like to propose a counter thesis. I would say you actually need dual leadership. You need one person who is totally pushy, egotistical, and narcissistic, and at the same time, you need someone next to them. Most of the time, these are actually leadership teams, right? Someone who is empathetic, who balances things out a bit, who brings people back in, and so on. When we talk about leadership, we actually always talk about individuals, right? Yes. But on the other hand, I think nowadays it's always important to have a team as well. And I believe one approach could be to say, you have leadership teams that also cover certain needs. And on the one hand, you have an egotist and a narcissist, and then you have someone who is a total team player, and of course, maybe even a second or third person as well. Also the question, do women perhaps have a different leadership style? That's often discussed. Personally, I believe they do. I also enjoy working with women. I think it brings something different to the table, and it's not always just the empathetic side. Women can be pretty tough, when it matters. Sometimes even tougher than us men. We all know that from our own personal experience. I think women can be extremely straightforward in that regard. So I believe the real question for a leadership team is, what kinds of personalities do you need to cover everything? And then you have to bring those together.
That's a really good example. I advise several management teams, several executive boards, and after a certain amount of time, the question always comes up, how much diversity do I actually have in my executive board, in my management team? And I don't just want to equate diversity with gender diversity, meaning simply having an equal number of men and women, but exactly what you said. What types, what personalities do I actually have on my team? And in what ways are they helpful and beneficial? Who should I put forward at what time and in what situation? Or which tasks should I delegate to whom? And I think the most important thing is first to become aware of the strength and power that this diversity and the different leadership styles bring to managing a company. That means it all starts with awareness. And in my experience, Mario, this is still a major hurdle for many companies to admit to themselves that there are different leadership styles. And by the way, that there must be different styles as well. There can't always be just one leadership style. There have to be different leadership styles that can also be adapted to the situation. And for me, it all starts with awareness.
Yes, and there's always the question, what can you actually achieve yourself as a leader? People always talk about this adaptive style, how you really are and how you present yourself. And sometimes, for example, I'm more of a team player myself. I can be straightforward too, but there are others who can be much tougher and much more direct, and they're also much, much better at it. And to be honest, I'm sometimes personally grateful when someone, maybe an egoist or even a narcissist, really pushes things to the limit and charges ahead, because of course that also has an effect. On the other hand, as I said, I'm also always the type who can bring people together, who can build teams, who can scale things and so on. I think conversely, the egoist and the narcissist are also glad to have someone like me or someone else who fits that type, because then you really form exactly the kind of team that can do both. And that's also good for the employees.
Absolutely right. And something that's important for me to mention here, Mario, we tend to use the word, narcissist quite a lot, and it definitely has a negative connotation, which in a way it also deserves. We think of the names we mentioned earlier at the beginning, who, in my view, have had quite a negative influence, or hopefully won't have it for much longer in that area. But I also think, as we mentioned at the beginning, that these narcissistic traits actually stem from a personal insecurity. I need validation. I have to be the center of attention. I need applause. So understanding this about oneself and at the same time realizing, well, if we applaud people for how they behave, then of course we're also encouraging that kind of leadership behavior. That's one aspect. Yes, please.
Okay, no, please go ahead first.
And the other point is, if we confuse this with a kind of leadership strength, which is sometimes necessary, as we just discussed, then we're also doing people a disservice, because we end up labeling many people as narcissists who actually aren't. They're just people who have this ability to regulate themselves and know that in certain moments, they need to act very tough and very strict in order to enforce certain things.
We should discuss leadership strength again in a moment. I just wanted to bring up one more point. Before this episode, we also talked about what should we call it. And one of the claims was, my boss is a narcissist. Now what? And that really raises the question, how do I, as an employee, deal with these types of people? Personally, I think a narcissist, an egoist, is actually a convenient boss because they're pretty easy to handle. If we take Trump as an example, you just have to flatter him, then he likes you. And if you don't flatter him and don't do what he wants, then he doesn't like you. These are also things that for an employee, I would say, set boundaries and can actually be good. But to come back to the topic of leadership strength, I ask myself the question, because leadership and strength are combined in one term, what does leadership strength actually mean? When am I actually strong as a leader? And for me, the question always arises. Strength also means uniting a team, leading it, shaping it into a team, recognizing and utilizing the individual strengths of each employee, and above all, saying, together we are stronger. And if we play to all our different strengths, we can achieve much more. That, for me, is also leadership strength.
Absolutely right. And exactly what you said, by looking at it from that perspective, it already shows that it's not that simple. There are different opinions about leadership strength depending on the perspective. And I completely agree with you. This ability to allow other opinions to form a team that is diverse, that is absolutely important, as opposed to, of course, understanding or defining leadership strength as something where someone makes decisions. Decisions can be made entirely alone. Sometimes that works and is even sustainable, but often it just doesn't work. Rather, making decisions based on different opinions from a discussion within the team, from a culture of conflict in the team, that in my view is leadership strength. Absolutely right.
Let's make it more tangible, Andre, because sometimes it can all get very, very vague. I'm a huge fan of the German Mittelstand. Many Mittelstand companies are organized in such a way that there's always a patriarch at the top. Not always, but often. Or maybe someone from the next generation who inherited the company and then takes it to completely new heights because they have that background. And I always find that incredibly admirable. Sometimes we get inquiries from companies I've never even heard of, for example. I look them up on Wikipedia or Google, and then you see 10,000 employees, 15,000 employees. And you think, I've never heard of them. Amazing. And then, of course, I always take a look at the leadership structure. Then, as a rule, there's also a strong family behind it, usually a family member who also runs the whole thing. And I always find that admirable as well, especially when we come back to the topic of leadership strength. They also lead strongly through tradition, through values. There's no exaggeration there. Instead, they say, we grow every year, but we grow in a healthy way. And a lot of importance is still placed on being a family or a community. So when there are multiple generations, if an employee has a son or daughter, they try to bring them into the company as well. And in my view, those are really great values, and you can see that they're extremely successful with them. Absolutely.
But of course, there are all kinds. So I was at an event again last week where CTOs from major German mid-sized companies gathered. And now you could say that's a kind of bubble too, because the CTOs who organize themselves there come from companies that, how should I put it, have realized that they need to change in order to remain successful in the long run. I would now attest to them, which is admittedly a bit black and white, but I would say that these companies have understood that the patriarch, to use your analogy, or the family at the top, is no longer all-knowing. Rather, that might have been the case in the past when, and we shouldn't forget this either, don't get me wrong, these companies, the great German Mittelstand, have been extremely successful because there were people at the top, people who achieved a lot, worked hard, had a vision, and pushed it through. And they did that incredibly well, so hats off to that. But nowadays, and we've already discussed this in previous episodes, the circumstances, the environment, the economic conditions, and the technology have all become so complex and fast-paced that it's simply no longer possible to leave decisions up to just one person. That's the positive side of things to begin with. And I think that's important. But there are still, thank goodness, Mario, there are fewer and fewer companies, at least from what I've observed, where these patriarchs, as I'll call them, don't look to the right or left, but still believe that the straight path they've defined is the right one. So now let's look at the topic, digitalization in the German SME sector. Thank goodness we've caught up a lot in that area, but there are studies on this as well, among the last places.
Yes, absolutely. And let's take a look at the German SME sector. Most of the ones I know have usually developed an extremely successful, innovative product or technology. And with that, of course, you have a USP. And I would argue that despite the narcissist and the egotist at the very top, who also push things through, the thing was successful simply because the product was usually so good. But today, due to the globalization of the economy, you naturally face the challenge. Copies or copycats are becoming more and more common. That means the product, the innovation, doesn't count for as much anymore. It's being copied more and more. You're losing your USP more and more. Today, of course, many can still differentiate themselves through service, for example, or through nuances in quality, especially if you're involved in production processes. That naturally plays a big role. But the gap to Asia or other countries or continents is small. And then it comes down to exactly this point. How does the narcissist react then, and how does the patriarch respond accordingly? He still believes he's unique, and then he pushes that through. And then from my point of view, exactly what you just said happens. Two alternatives come into play. Either you open up and allow others to join in and bring in their experiences, or you get stuck and then you go under.
Mario, that's absolutely right. And that reminds me of a discussion I had 2 weeks ago. You know, the innovation we've seen in recent years worldwide, but of course also in Germany, has always been very product specific. And a product doesn't just have to be a hardware product. It can also be a software product, no question about it. And I don't want to say that innovation in products isn't still necessary and promising, of course. It will continue to be. But the kind of innovation that especially the German Mittelstand now needs to tackle is the innovation of business models. So how do I bring my product, which has been successful for years, to the customer in a different business model? Usage-oriented, subscription-based, and so on. Just a few examples. And I think that could also be an exciting topic, Mario, for us to dive into.
Yes, subscription and business models are, of course, super interesting. Andre, I'm with you on that. We should definitely put that on our list. I'm also thinking of many people I know in that area right now. In the Mittelstand, those who run medium-sized businesses, they are, of course, also facing major challenges because the speed in global trade and on the world market has become immense. And you can really see that, and I'll say this quite deliberately, the sluggish Mittelstand in Germany, there are some who are very innovative, very fast, but of course there are also many who have made themselves comfortable, especially the employees. Maybe you still go home at noon on Fridays, and that's something you simply can't afford anymore today. That means only if you change course as a Mittelstand company will you remain competitive.
Yes, absolutely. Mario, I'd really like to focus on one more point and go back to the beginning. We've kind of discussed the question a bit. Why do we actually reward narcissistic leadership? Why do we applaud? Why do we look for this supposed leadership strength in that corner? And I believe, and I've seen this very clearly over the past years during my corporate career, that we're putting more and more focus on the how rather than just the pure KPIs, rather than just the numbers. I've always said, folks, a good leader doesn't just deliver their numbers or their KPIs, but a good leader also leads according to our values. And from my point of view, leading according to leadership principles, values, whatever you want to call it, is almost more important than just meeting KPIs or budgets or numbers. How do you see it?
I think that's an important point, especially in relation to the war for talent. At the end of the day, you depend on your employees. It's becoming increasingly difficult to find the right people. And we notice that as a company, for example. That means if we lose top performers, replacing them costs a lot of money and takes a long time. And the question is, you always run the risk, can it even be done? Because people are always very specific after all. I'm also a fan of really having a feedback culture, 360-degree feedback within the company, because, a leader who deals reasonably with their team and who clearly and actively engages the team makes decisions together. But is also sometimes clear, that's part of it, I think, has nothing to fear. So someone who is seen as a good leader will also receive good 360-degree feedback. In contrast, now we're back to the narcissist. They may be successful in their own right, but if they always just push through their own agenda and don't bring the employees along, then first, employees and top performers will sometimes leave the company. And on the other hand, there won't be any good feedback either.
That's how it is. And I believe that a style of leadership where you keep an eye on the numbers, the KPIs as a leader, but at the same time, of course, also think about how you lead values are based on leadership principles and so on, that with this approach, you can be more sustainably and long-term successful as a leader, but also for companies to be more successful in the long term and more sustainably than by just focusing solely on who is now particularly strong in leadership, supposedly strong in leadership.
There's one topic I'd like to bring up again, the topic of AI. Because the question is, how do we always have three topics, sales, leadership, and AI. And how does the topic of AI fit in now? So when we talk, Andre, we always say, come on, let's just quickly check ChatGPT and so on. I think that's becoming more and more a part of leadership. It helps us, it gives us speed, it helps us to make decisions, to prepare decisions, and of course also beforehand. And I think that's a very, very important topic. And I was at a conference last week, and I also gave a talk there. And I always said there, the fish rots from the head down. That means as a leader, I can't expect my employees to use AI. like in the classic narcissistic, egotistical way. Come on, you all have to do this. Now I'm the big ruler who delegates everything. But nowadays, it's also about setting an example, and especially from my point of view, setting an example when it comes to AI. If I want to create an AI-centered company and also want to develop leaders, then I have to use it myself.
Absolutely. And that's why, Mario, you probably that also see this in your client projects that you manage or implement in the AI environment. I'll put it in black and white again. All AI projects fail mercilessly in companies where the leadership does not have full commitment, does not help shape things themselves to some extent, and of course does not set an example. And that's always my first point. I mean, over the past few years, I've also gone through a learning curve and used to think it was enough if the IT department handled it. No, that's simply not enough. You really have to have it defined and exemplified by management, by the board, and you have to make sure that people in the company see that this is important. That's a very important point.
Yes, our time is almost up now. Let's quickly summarize the most important points, dear Andre. So what are we leaving people with now? Well, first of all, from my perspective, I would like to remind people that narcissism and egoism are not necessarily always something bad in themselves. Secondly, you have to form teams where maybe a narcissist or an egoist is included, but you also have to create counterbalances to strengthen empathy and to enhance team building. And if you have these counterbalances, then a narcissist or an egoist can actually be extremely helpful. You also mentioned earlier, temporarily, of course, it's always a question of what I might need at that moment. If I now, in the short term, really want to grow rapidly, also in terms of revenue, then a narcissist or an egoist with a large network can be an absolute asset and can really help. But as I said, always in combination with other personalities in leadership. And we also said that there need to be different levels of leadership, which should also be represented within a team accordingly. And that's something you have to keep in mind, and then you can be successful.
Exactly. And if I may add one more thing, Mario, I absolutely agree. And I would just like to phrase one thing a little more pointedly. In my view, we shouldn't label people as you're an egoist or you're a narcissist. Instead, I think we need to pay attention to which situations egoistic or narcissistic traits can actually be helpful and where they are not. And we need to pay attention to whether the leaders we have possess the ability to regulate themselves and say, here, I need to take a tougher approach, so to speak. And here I consciously hold myself back and try not to put myself in the spotlight. And of course, we can help define and shape this within leadership cultures. That we also create frameworks and opportunities within companies to give or convey this capacity for reflection to leaders, at least to some extent. And I think that's really important.
And we definitely recommend 360-degree feedback from employees, because only then can I really recognize the different personalities. I also get to find out, if I'm the CEO now, what strengths do my people actually have? And that's when certain people always stand out to me. And it's not just the narcissists and egotists. There are also plenty of other personalities that aren't good for employees. And of course, you have to weed out the bad apples as well.
That's right. Exactly. In that sense, thank you very much for the conversation, dear Andre. I really enjoyed the discussion. I hope, dear listeners and viewers, that you were able to take something away from this. And yes, stay human. Stay human. Thank you very much.